And so, becoming a cardiologist, one thing that became clearly evident to me is that diabetes and heart disease are almost like synonymous terms. Essentially, in practice, if you have diabetes, we treat you virtually the same as if you have heart disease. There is no real true difference because of the fact that we know what really ensues.
Welcome to the Mastering Diabetes audio experience, where we'll teach you how to reverse insulin resistance, achieve your ideal body weight, gain energy, and get your best A1C following almost 100 years of evidence-based research.
We're on a bold mission to reverse insulin resistance in 1 million people. We're glad to have you joining us.
Welcome back to the Mastering Diabetes audio experience. In today's episode, we are going to be interviewing Dr. Columbus Batiste. Now, this is a phenomenal episode because Dr. Columbus Batiste is not only a very intelligent guy, but he's also a storyteller, and he has a really interesting way in which he can connect complicated physiology with real-life situations to really help you understand the ins and outs of diabetes physiology and heart disease at the same time. Now, Dr. Columbus Batiste is a board-certified interventional cardiologist and the assistant clinical professor at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine. He's also been recognized for his work in the community to help people across all demographics.
Now, Dr. Batiste is on a mission to share information so that each one can teach one about the benefits of plant-based nutrition, daily exercise, and stress reduction, which we talk all about today. So this is a big show about stress in a lot of different ways. So pay close attention to that. And therefore, he helps people provide education to everyone so that anybody can take control of their health.
Now, Dr. Batiste has also, his passion for helping people of all walks of life has led to the formation of a nonprofit organization called the Healthy Heart Nation, which provides education through lectures, through newsletters, through social and digital media as well.
And Dr. Batiste co-hosts a show called Conversations with the Doctors. And we're going to put a link below. Wherever you're listening or watching this, there'll be a link. We'll have a link to his website. This guy has an infectious personality. You're going to want to stay in touch with him. So definitely click those links below. And we hope you enjoy the show today.
Columbus, we are so glad to be here with you today. How you doing, my man?
I am well. It's good to see both of you. I hear lots of changes.
It's great to see you. It's been way too long since we've seen you in person. I can't wait for the next conference, whenever that's going to be.
Yes. I cannot wait. We may have to go ahead and fly out to wherever you all are at so I can have a nice sit down with you.
I think a trip to Miami is a good idea.
Love it. Yes, I'm in.
Hey, where's my invitation?
You're coming? You're invited too, Cyrus. You're always invited.
Jeez, I hope so. So, Columbus, today we're going to talk about a whole collection of things, but the main topic here is we're going to be talking about cardiovascular disease, given that you're a prominent cardiologist and you know a whole bunch about plant-based nutrition and diabetes. And then we can talk a lot about stress and diabetes, as well as stress and just chronic disease in general. So maybe we start off the top here by having you explain to our audience what is the relationship between diabetes and heart disease.
That's a great intro and conversation. I mean, as you all know, I grew up with diabetes, right? Because my dad had diabetes as long as I could remember. Oftentimes we'll joke around and say I was the pleasant surprise, not just solely because I'm the fifth of 5 children, but because my dad had diabetes that ravaged his body for many years before, and we know one of the ill effects that can happen as a result of diabetes is impotence, right? And so I truly was a pleasant surprise as it relates to it. So diabetes is very close to my heart as I watched him throughout his life and so forth. And so becoming a cardiologist, one thing that became clearly evident to me is that diabetes and heart disease are almost like synonymous terms. Essentially, in practice, if you have diabetes, we treat you virtually the same as if you have heart disease. There is no real true difference because of the fact that we know what really ensues, right? So we know that you're at a heightened risk of having a cardiovascular event. Nearly twice as likely to have a cardiovascular event. I think 2 or 4 times as likely to die from some cardiovascular event. That means a heart disease or stroke when you have diabetes. And so they are so integrally related in this thing we now characterize as cardiometabolic syndrome. We put a fancy term on something that has existed forever, which is an umbrella term that says, hey, if you have heart disease and diabetes and you have kidney disease, that we need to address these as cardiologists. And so that's something where we know this relationship is there. You know, what's interesting is, this sounds bad, but one of the reasons why I went into cardiology, one of the main reasons is I love this being very specific and tailored and honing in on the heart. But one thing we've learned is we can't just do that. We have to treat the whole body, not just a part, but the whole entire body. And so we can't ignore diabetes. So that's why diabetes is so important.
Okay, cool. I'm actually really glad to hear you say this because a lot of times I refer to diabetes as being nothing more than a vascular condition. It's literally a collection of simple symptoms that result from vascular problems. So it sounds like you're saying pretty much the exact same thing using slightly different words.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. I mean, I think, you know, being a cardiovascular specialist, obviously I believe the vascular system is of supreme importance. And so when you look at this, that endothelium, that special lining of the vessels, that superhero-like layer of cells, that really, really predicts so many different disease states. And diabetes is one of many of those. And so when the effects of really the root cause of many chronic diseases takes hold, it really impacts this thing called the endothelium, and it courses all the way from your head to your toes. So it's not really a surprise that we see these detrimental effects occur, whether or not it's diabetes or stroke or cancers and gastrointestinal disorders, because of this huge network of the vasculature.
I love it. I love it. That's great. So one of the things that you talk a lot about is stress in particular. And I really want to like zero in on stress a lot because 2020 was a stressful year. There's no question about it. And, you know, the world is recovering. We're in 2021 and, you know, life seems to be getting more back to normal. But, you know, in addition to stress that the pandemic might have put on people's lives, there's also just an underlying stress that all of us carry from work, from life, from family, from, you know, trying to accomplish multiple things at the same time. So first question to you here is, why do you talk about stress so much? What relevance does it have to people living with diabetes or people living with heart disease in particular?
Yeah, no, you know, I'll tell you, it goes back before I had even decided which direction I wanted to take in this field called medicine. And I remember after I graduated from med school, and it was back in the days when you had to walk backwards uphill and you had to dig through shovels of snow in order to kind of get to your endpoint. And so I had taken call, one of my first weeks of call. And there was no restrictions. So we stayed up 30, 40 hours, and that was like your badge of honor, right? Staying sleepless nights. And I remember driving home, windows down, trying to stay awake, and talking to my sister on the phone. And she had a brand new baby at that time. And she was asking me, well, hey, Columbus, did you take care of X, Y, and Z for mom and dad, or do this, or do that? And she's just firing in a true form of an older sister, right? Giving me directions. I said, listen, I said, do you understand what I do for a living? Do you know that I've been up all these hours and just a little bit stressed and haven't had time? And she said to me in that moment, she said, listen, you're not the only one stressed. I have a young baby, and if I fall asleep, then bad things can happen to her. And she started to go on, and I stopped in that moment. And I realized that stress is something that is individual, and it's something that we all perceive differently. And that was my first introduction to stress, that then followed suit with seeing the impact of stress as it relates to the cardiovascular system, stress as it relates to diabetes, and then further beginning to explore this thing called stress, which really is hard to grasp hold of. Years ago in the 1980s, the Supreme Court said, pornography, we can't define it, but you know it when you see it. Stress is hard to define. It's so individual, but we know its ill effects when we see it. And so I started reviewing the literature and seeing that perceived stress really began the process of being related to multiple disease states. That when there is an increased perception of stress, the increased risk of diabetes, increased risk of stress, increased risk of central adiposity, increased risk of stress, cardiovascular events, and on and on and on as we look at these phenomena. And so we know that stress is intimately related to disease. And so I started looking at this, and who's more subjugated towards stress are really the working class. It's our women who have to wear so many multiple hats of being professional and mothers and caregivers and things of that nature. And so we see this burden of stress and its ill effects on us.
Okay, so another thing you talk about is nutritional stress. So what is nutritional stress?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think when I looked at stress, we all have our little quips and have our little equations. So one of the things that it realized as I was sitting there and I was doing this new type of schooling for the kids, right? And we all got introduced to this during those of us who had kids during COVID. But even before, there's a new type of math, Common Core, that you had to figure out. And so I came up with this health equation. I said our health equals our resiliency divided by our stress. The higher our stress, once we surpass that threshold, the poorer our health. The higher our stress, the poorer our health. The higher our resiliency, the better our health. And so as I began to look at this, I said, well, what happens? This old analogy that's there. It's a palindrome. What does stress equal? Dessert spelled backwards. It seems like every time that someone gets stressed out, what do? They turn to something. They turn to a double date with Ben and Jerry's. They go and they entertain all these different things is what I realized speaking with patients and even recognizing my own proclivities, even before I kind of came into this enlightenment in terms of nutrition, that I would turn to these things. And so I realized that stress was intimately related to our nutrition. And so I started kind of looking in the very similar way that the World Health Organization defines health. I started looking at, well, what is nutritional stress? Nutritional stress is not just eating disease-forming foods. It's also the absence of health-promoting foods inside your diet, right? And so when we look at this paradigm, because too often we sit and we focus on, I don't do this, I don't do that, I don't do the other, I don't eat dairy, I don't eat meat, I don't eat this. True story. I'm inside of doing procedures yesterday. I'm still an interventional cardiologist. And so I'm doing procedures yesterday and I meet this lady, right? And so I looked through her report about 5 years earlier. And so it showed blocked arteries here and there and treating her medically. And so I come in and I talked to her. I said, well, what's changed? She said, well, I adopted a vegan lifestyle. And my eyes perked up for a little bit. Now, I had just given the staff a lecture 3 days before, so the nurse looks over at me at the corner of her eye with a little smirk, right? And so I said, well, that's wonderful. I said, bravo to you for making a change. I said, that's beneficial for you. I said, so let's talk about things. As I walked her through her lifestyle, I walked her through her food that she eats. I said, well, tell me about the foods that you eat. And she said, well, I'm vegan. I said, well, yeah. I said, well, vegan can mean lots of things. I said, tell me about what you eat. And so I started kind of pointing out to her. I said, here's the thing at the end. I said, the enemy is the standard American diet, full of highly refined processed foods, rich in fat, salt, and sugar. I said, so you can get vegan style everything, cookies and burgers and fries and pizza and chips and she was like, yeah. She looked sheepishly at me as she said that she had gained weight. And she goes, yeah, I have been having some of those things. And I said, yeah. I said, so I want you to focus not on what you're not eating, but what you are adding to your diet. We're going to focus because nutritional stress is not, yes, it's the bad foods, but it's also the absence of the health promoting foods. And that's what I try and focus folks on, because when you look at the breakdown, and I know you guys will get a kick out of this, you start getting into advanced glycation end products, right? You start getting into oxidative stress and you start getting into free radicals, right? And how they go and they damage, and all these are stressors that are there. That are accentuated by the way in which we adopt certain food practices and the way in which we go about it. And so this creates this added stress in our body that adds back to that health equation. Our health equals our resiliency divided by our stress. So our nutrition can add either to our resiliency or it can add to our stress.
Okay, so let's switch gears here a little bit. Even before COVID, you have spoken about health disparities. So what role does stress and nutritional stress play in health disparities?
Yeah, clearly I'm African American, right? And so one of the biggest areas that 2020 really uncovered was the disparities in health outcomes across the United States. Now, this wasn't really buried because the scientific literature has been reporting this for years. You know, they called it like the eight Americas back in the early 2000s, and looking at the demographic breakdown of a relationship of different ethnic groups to where their status really is. And when you look on a bigger picture, the biggest disparity that we see, let me take a few steps back. America as a whole is living sicker and dying sooner than other nations, right? We saw that even during COVID. We're more likely, we look at all of the statistics, we do poor as it relates to diabetes. We do poorly as it relates to heart disease. We do poorly as it relates to all these different chronic ailments as a nation, a mighty nation full of incredibly intelligent individuals and the highest technology, right? And so as a subgroup, we see that there are certain subgroups within American culture that also live sicker and die sooner. And we see that in terms of the African American population. And so one of the things that I felt is that this message that you all deliver so mightily in terms of like the power of mastering diabetes and the power of the relationship of nutrition is that I see this as a superhero movie. We were talking about enjoying life, and one of the things that my wife loves, and I've since adopted it, is watching movies. And we watch superhero movies religiously. Every superhero movie has an origin. You all shared your origin story, right? Of what really sent you along this pathway to fight the evil of diabetes, right? And change directions that are there. But we also know that every superhero is slightly different. You have Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman. It's all good versus evil framed in a different context. And so what I've focused on is I've decided to take this superhero movie and deliver it into a different community, right? And shape it and frame it in a context, a social context that they can understand. And so what have I learned is I've learned through the research that we see that areas of stress are pervasive throughout all of society. We spoke about that. But there's a unique stressor, discriminatory stress that happens, right? It could be a person's sexual orientation. It could be a person's gender. It could be a person's ethnicity that sets them apart and leads to discrimination. And we know studies have shown and affirmed that that's a form of stress. And that when people just simply perceive that they're being having this stressor aimed at them, they're more inclined to have ill effects. They're more inclined to have diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, all these particular variables that are there. Now, when you mix in that historically there's numerous communities, you know, whether or not you're inside Miami, whether or not you're inside of Philadelphia, New York, California, inside South Central LA, you may have neighborhoods where you may not really have much of a grocery store, that you now live in these crucibles of conflict. There's high stress, you have perceived discrimination, and then you're surrounded by nutritional stress. And we already spoke about one of the things that happens when you're stressed, you turn to food. So now you have all that's around you, this brand recognition of these foods that are detrimental to you. And then in the school system, you have additional foods that are laying in this brand recognition for you too as well. And so it creates this crucible of disparities that ends up subjugating a lot of people and forcing them down a pathway that's dragging down our nation from a standpoint of the health outcomes.
So this is actually really interesting because I know COVID as a sort of general phenomenon that happened in 2020 placed a lot of stress on a lot of different demographics. It placed stress on people because a lot of people became unemployed. It placed stress on people because now they were normally in their work environment and now they were at home trying to get work done amidst kids who were now at home and they were having to wear multiple hats, doing their work and playing the role of homeschooler, right? It placed a lot of stress on people because they were now cooped up inside and they couldn't get outdoors as much as they normally would because, you know, they were not supposed to or they were afraid of going outside of their house. So given what you've just talked about, how there's sort of like many different pockets of society with different challenges placed on top of them, from your understanding and from your work, has COVID itself placed more stress and sort of like exacerbated the inequalities between different demographics within society?
I think absolutely. Yeah, I think absolutely. And that's precisely the correct characterization, is that we've all been under tremendous stress. And one thing that came out in the midst of COVID is that, I don't know if you all have heard of this thing called the broken heart syndrome, Takotsubo disorder, or your guest out there. And so that's a phenomenon we call the stress-induced or the broken heart, stress-induced cardiomyopathy, which means a weak heart muscle, or broken heart syndrome. So we oftentimes think of a broken heart in terms of a romantic scenario with Romeo and Juliet. But in actuality, a broken heart is a surge of catecholamines that occurs that can mimic a heart attack, but there's no significant blockages in the arteries of the heart. The heart ceases to pump, and it actually takes on the appearance of like an octopus, where you have the central part, it squeezes and the rest of it balloons out. And so we also call it apical ballooning syndrome. That's called stress-induced cardiomyopathy. What studies showed was that increased separate from COVID infections during 2020, as reported by Cleveland Clinic. And so we know that this has been pervasive. We know that people we spoke about social distancing, but this led to a detriment, right? Because we know we need that connectivity. We need to bond. We need this sense of belonging. And one of the things that COVID brought about, like you mentioned, is it brought this isolation. It brought in the fact that folks they may not have even had pets, right? So studies have shown, like your cat right there, it can be really stress relieving, right? It can help with depression. It can help patients recover from heart attacks, literally by having animals. And so powerful just by having a loving animal that's here. But many people didn't even have that. They didn't have human contact. They didn't have any of these things. And so we see the stress level increase. We see that people were afraid to come in for medical checks. There was a case in which in our hospital, someone had such a preventable thyroid issue. They did not come in for nearly a year that by the time they came in, they were nearly comatose from a treatable thyroid condition where the heart was profoundly dysfunctional. So when you speak to the issues of stress and the lack of attention, this was indeed pervasive, and COVID really delineated. And I think we're going to see its effects for years to come, is what my personal belief is. I believe that typically after every infectious bout, there is a rebound effect in terms of cardiovascular events, of reduced heart function, and everything else. You look at this, so I would tell you, right? So we talked about that magical layer called the endothelium. There's studies that have shown just the power of laughing and smiling. It has powers on your endovascular system, your endothelium. Sure. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But it's all these things play such a huge role in our health and well-being, and adding to our resiliency as opposed to our stress.
Okay, I love this conversation for 1,000 reasons, but as soon as you said the word catecholamine, my mind went crazy because I'm a super nerd at heart, and I love talking about biological mechanisms. So I love talking about the biological mechanisms of insulin sensitivity, of insulin resistance, of blood glucose dysregulation, of microbiome dysregulation, and beyond. In this context of talking about the intersection between cardiovascular diseases and diabetes, walk our audience through some of the biological mechanisms of stress, meaning when somebody experiences stress, what happens in their adrenal gland, and then how does that message translate into an altered state of physiology inside of their vasculature and or heart and or liver and or muscle tissue? Tell us everything that you know.
No, it's huge. Well, I mean, first of all, we're beautifully and wonderfully made. And so the idea of stress, we need stress, so every animal is not, some animals can be a little vicious. So growing up in the city, sometimes you might have to run away from an animal. I'm going to tell you, I went out for a walk, and I have a nice, peaceful neighborhood. I don't live like where I grew up anymore. And so I'm walking. All of a sudden, I see these two dogs just descend. And they're actually looking like if they're starting to chase me. And so in that moment, I feel my body energize. I mean, I feel like I'm powerful. I'm about to take off and run and everything like that, until cooler thoughts prevailed. And I decided I was just going to go ahead and act calmly and just say, hi, little puppies, and keep going. But what happens during a stressful time is you get this surge, and your body prepares to fight or to flee. Right? And so that happens in an instance, and you don't think about it. It's a process that occurs. It's autonomic. It's an automatic process that triggers you to get going. And so your pupils change and dilate in order to get going. Your blood begins to shift in an instance. Your mouth may become dry, like when you're sitting down with two exceptional interviewers who are knowledgeable, and then one of them starts to grill you. We used to call it a particular word inside med school and says, I want you to tell me the pathophys, waiting to tear me apart, you know? The mouth starts to get a little dry and I don't know what to do. And so all of a sudden the blood shunts away to my large muscle groups from my skin, and I may feel clammy. I may feel a little bit damp that's right there. All of a sudden it shifts from my stomach system as well. What happens is the body says the muscles need what in order to fire on all cylinders? They need glucose. So it begins this process of producing and spewing out some of the blood sugar that's there, creating almost a diabetic state. The blood vessels begin to crimp down, preparing to deliver the amount of forceful cardiac output, because your cardiac output, your heart strength, is a mixture of what we call the heart rate, the pulse, and the strength, the stroke volume of the heart. Right, that stroke volume mixed with what we call total peripheral resistance. And so your vessels begin to squeeze down, creating a hypertensive state too as well. All of a sudden your attention becomes super focused in that instance too, likewise. And so it's useful. It comes on suddenly and then it dissipates suddenly. But unfortunately, here's the catch. That when we live in a chronic, persistent, perpetual state of stress, a perceived stress, that maybe I'm stressed because of a situation where you all mean no harm to me. I tell another story, right? I tell a story, this is probably about 20 years ago. And I was down in Cabo San Lucas, and my wife was there, a buddy of mine who's a urologist, and his wife who's a family practice doc. We were all on this boat, and we were taking a nice boat cruise, and we're sitting there relaxing. All of a sudden I look over to the side, and the guy is just staring at us. He's staring at us, like staring me down, and he had sunglasses on, so I couldn't tell what was going on. You know, I'm like, okay, what's the problem here? You know, do I have to show you my medical ID? I'm just a doctor. I'm just a nerd, man. Don't come at me or whatever else. And so next thing I know, you know, he's getting up, and I keep eyeballing him. I got my wife, I got her hand next to me. I grab her hand, like, yeah, okay, babe, I got you. And he gets up and he starts moseying over with a bottle of beer, right? And he has a southern drawl. And so all of a sudden my mind begins to run rampant. And I'm like, oh boy, is it going to be go time? I was like, okay, remember all your Tybo you were doing working out. Let's get ready. Billy Blanks, let's get it ready, right? And I look up and he comes over with the southern drawl and he says, hey, how y'all doing? I just wanted to say hi. That's all. My wife loves your bathing suit and everything. In that moment, I perceived stress. I perceived a situation that was not reality. It may have been reality, but in that situation, it was not. I perceived it. Now, in terms of my body, there's no faking it. My body responds to this. And this is what studies have confirmed. It's confirmed that your body will respond if you're seeing a scary movie. Your body will respond towards like the stressors of life, and that your body will respond in such a way that it makes you more inclined towards these disease states. And it's for this persistence that leads to insomnia that then throws off your hormones, your ghrelin and your leptin, that then impact your resistance to insulin and your mood too as well. And so it's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle.
This is great. I love the way you tell this story, actually, because it's almost like your brain has a difficult time differentiating between perceived stress and real stress. And to a certain extent, it doesn't even matter. Right? You could have a stressful dream and you can wake up having a sort of fight or flight mechanism, and you can have an adrenaline rush, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, okay, I know now that I'm awake that that was not a real scenario and my mind was just inventing a story. But for the period in time in which you were experiencing that stress, it was real.
Yes.
Right? The fight or flight mechanism was alive inside of your body, and blood was being redirected. Your heart rate might have increased a little bit. You might have started to sweat a little bit. And all of that is a completely normal and perfectly evolutionarily conserved biological mechanism. It's functioning exactly the way it's supposed to. Mm-hmm. But your point is that perceived stress and real stress manifest in the same way. Yeah. And so if perceiving that on a daily basis, and you're living in a chronic stress state, there's no question that that's going to result in an altered state of physiology that could lead to an increased chronic disease risk. So on that note, then, if somebody approaches you and say, "Hey, Dr. Batiste, I'm a stressed individual. My anxiety is high. I have a difficult time sleeping. My blood pressure is high, and I have high cholesterol. Help me," right? Yeah. what are some recommendations that you can offer to people who know that they're stressed and are trying to reduce their stress level, but yet feel like they're kind of caught in a tornado of a life that's imposing stressful situations on top of them?
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about this recently. Just, I know what my answer is to people when I tell them, but I was thinking about my approach and how I adopted this, and I think my brain subconsciously over the years has put together a way in which I tell people just get selfish. That's it. You have to be selfish. And so people oftentimes, they look at me and they're a little kind of odd, like, what do you mean by be selfish? Get selfish, right? And I'll tell them, if you listen to any great athlete, who is inducted into the Hall of Fame, you listen to, I don't know if any of you all are sports fans. So I'm a huge sports fan of all sports, but I probably follow most basketball and football. But during playoffs, I follow virtually all sports. And so I was listening to Kobe Bean Bryant's induction into the Hall of Fame by his wife. And I watched it, not real time, but afterwards I was actually on call listening to it. And one of the things she mentioned was that he had an insatiable hunger for greatness. And so it did not let him stop anything. And he tried his best to be there for his family, and he was. But that was his priority in that moment, which means he had to be selfish. And every single person who achieves a level, there's a level of selfishness. And so in order to achieve the level of your overall state of health and well-being, you have to be selfish. Now, what do I mean by that? The S stands for being spiritual. Now, whether or not that means your deep breathing, whether or not that means getting out into nature, whether or not that means mindfulness or meditation or prayer, because the studies have shown in terms of the power on the prefrontal cortex that can lay a keystone habit for you, right? And so taking that, we also know that increasing your breathing, it heightens your parasympathetic tone, right? Which is the alternative to the stressful state. So by exhaling, you're actually heightening your parasympathetic tone to lower down, which is why you'll see people when they're giving a talk or they're out there about ready to perform, they take deep breaths and breathe out slowly. That's where there's power that's there, right? So that's the S. And so whatever your belief system, at a minimum, we can engage as far as in terms of breathing as an exercise that's there. What's the E stand for? Well, we all know it's exercise. But I don't mean exercise the way most people think. Most people think I mean CrossFit. Most people think I mean some extreme cardiovascular or HIIT program. I mean just simply getting neat with it. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Standing, walking, cooking, talking on the phone, pacing, whatever it may be, moving. Movement is important, right? We were meant to move. And we know the power of that. You all know this extremely well. In terms of diabetes, the improvement in your blood sugar just by walking 10 minutes after you eat, the power that's there. We know from cardiovascular, just simply walking, the benefits that have been shown with that. What's the L for? Well, it's the problem that's deficient inside the United States. It's love. Love. This power of empathy, being able to empathize with others. And many have spoken about the oxytocin love hormone and how it can be the once again, the antidote towards stress. That during stressful times, yeah, we seek to kind of sit down and watch the TV. Yeah, we seek to maybe have I spoke about the food, but you also seek human contact, to go ahead and have a discussion with someone. That bonding, that connectivity that's there, that's a part of the healing process. That oxytocin that's released, that love, that empathizing has power there with you. The F is the central component, which is food. Real food, whole food, plant-rich foods, foods that's recognizable, food that will decay, food that is made of plants, not built in plants, right? We all know the little sayings that go along with it. That's where the power is. The I stands for intimacy. It doesn't mean in a sexual way, but just like that little, what's your cat's name, Cyrus?
Mew.
Mew. Oh, now that's a version of an original name there, Mew. Okay, all right.
That's right. It's like meow without the O, just Mew.
Yeah, I love it. So you have an intimate relationship with your pet. And so when my mom, who's 80, will be 86, bless her heart, right? She hates whenever I call out her age, but it's such a blessing. And I see how her dog is so attentive to her that when she's in pain she doesn't have any chronic disease except just a little back pain and knee pain. When she's in pain, her dog knows. When she's moving, when she's sad, her dog knows. That's an intimate relationship. There's power that's there of having, it's not in numbers. It's in specific individuals who can help you connect and bond, right? And that's what that is for. What's the other S for in selfish? Sleep. something that we're all so devoid of in this day and age. And we spoke briefly about the power of sleep, of how the brain is able to sweep out the memories that it doesn't need, or the interactions. And we all wake up and can remember things. We solve the answer to our problems. Our brain is so powerful, and sleep is needed. Not 5 hours, not 4 hours, not 6 hours, but 7 to 9 hours. That may be hard to do, but it means that part of connecting back to the beginning, that mindfulness, that meditation, the exercise, the love, the food, they all play a role in helping your sleep in the future, right? And then what's the last one? Humor, laughter, smiling, the power on your endothelium, going time all the way back full circle to strengthen the body, to strengthen that lining of the vessel that's so predictive of disease. So I tell people you have to be selfish. And you can't accomplish that inside just a second. It means that you have to be very intentional. You have to set reasonable, achievable targets. That means that we have to do it with love and say, you know what? I'm going to treat myself with love and forgiveness. I'm going to go ahead and say, if I eat horribly, I may not be able to eat the way of Cyrus and Robbie starting away, and I'm not going to beat myself up, but I'm going to commit to one small habit, at least to start off. I'm going to transform my breakfast, or transform my snacks, or transform my lunch, and begin to build on that. Not stop there, but build on it until I get to their level. And so it's having a tangible, reachable goal, but starting small in many instances and going from there. So that's what I tell folks. That's my approach from a full overriding perspective of whole body approach.
Dr. Batiste, you're a gem. I wish we could talk to you just all day. We got to get you back on the podcast soon. You are just such a wealth of knowledge and experience. You're so eloquent. I love your stories. I just love this show. Maybe I'll re-listen to it myself. But let's have you be a little selfish here and tell us where people can find you. How can they connect with you? Our audience is going to be very curious.
No, appreciate that. So I'm not that great. We've spoken before on social media. I'm trying to have more of a presence there, but I'm on IG, as Instagram as Healthy Heart Doc, and on Facebook at Healthy Heart Doc. I do host a little show that really focuses on that paradigm, that intersection between stress, discrimination, nutritional stress, and then what's uniquely titled slave food, right? And so it's not a historical labeling, but it's more of the fact that we oftentimes are enslaved to our environment. We're enslaved to our circumstances. We're enslaved to many of those things, and we feel and that leads to us being chained to diseases, whether or not it's mental or physical diseases. And so how can we break the chains? It's by getting selfish. And so that's what that particular, and that's found on YouTube at Slave Food Project. And those are the main ways, or thehealthyheartdoc.org online to it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We'll make sure all the links are below this show so people can click them and connect with you. So thank you again.
Appreciate you guys, as always.
Thank you, Dr. Batiste. This is super helpful, actually, because I love the way that you not only are you talking about the importance of being selfish, but you actually turn it into an acronym. And I've told people for a long time that, like, you got to get focused on yourself. You got to have you time, and that you time enables you to do the things that you like to do the things that are going to make you the best version of yourself. And when you are functioning at your optimal, then you can be of service to others most powerfully, right? So I love the fact that you focus on being selfish, not in the traditional view of the word, but from a perspective of doing what's necessary for yourself so that you can thrive, so that you can help others the best. So beautifully stated. And I appreciate all of your biological expertise as well as your emotional support here. So thank you for being here. And, we look forward to talking with you again.
Appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. And next time, could you not give me a pop quiz in the middle of our conversation, sir? That would be helpful for me in the future. At least let me know to prepare.
It reminds me, actually, when I went through my qualifying exam during my PhD, it was the same kind of thing where there was a panel of 5 different professors who all have at any moment in time can throw out the most random of random questions that are related to, like, molecular biology that you have to know the answer to. And when you don't know the answer to it, all of a sudden you're like, oh God, I'm in fight or flight right now. You just turn your back and you're just like, oh God, what is the answer? What is the answer? What is the answer? And then you have to, like, reason your way through it. So I just wanted to pass on that fight or flight mechanism to you, but you responded beautifully in the situation and you crushed it. So nice work.
I appreciate that. I received the same thing. And what's interesting is that my attendings, as we call them, they always say, you know, Batiste, you always like to start off by saying what you know, right? And this and that and the other. Could you get to just the question as I try to talk myself into the answer?
That's great.
It's so true. Sometimes you just have to think it out loud. And
That's right. That's right.
It's totally fine.
All right.
But it's brilliant. So thanks again for being cool, and we'll see you again in the future.
All right. Appreciate you guys. Take care.